Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, brought to you and presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I introduce to you Brother Chris Ludke.
This is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore Masonry under the Reich, Part 5. Now, in the past 4 episodes, we've dealt with what happened up to the Nazis, 1933, what happened under the Nazis, what happened during the war, either in continental Europe or in the camps. So we've dealt with a lot of different ideas, but we haven't dealt with how Masonry will rebuild in Germany. Why is this podcast, for many, the first introduction to Masonry under the Reich? Why isn't this something that we talk about on a more regular basis? How did this forgotten period of Masonic history form? Who created it and why? The first half of this episode, we're going to focus on rebirth. How did the German lodges rebuild? In the second, we're going to focus on the idea of memory. We're going to be diving into some nuance, some theory as to what happened. Now, to give you an idea of what post-war Germany looks like, the Allies have firebombed Hamburg, Copenhagen, Berlin, Dresden, so much of Germany. It is now split between the Soviets in the east and the Western occupiers on the other side, the Americans, the French, the British. They all have their zones, the Soviet zone being about 1/2 of Germany. And if you live in one of those zones, things are probably destroyed. If you lived in a city, it is gone. You live in rubble. Your job is gone. Your livelihood is probably gone for years to come. Your home, everything you've built, possibly everything you own, is gone. And this leads to a post-war European existential crisis. We see it in art, we see it in literature, we see it elsewhere, where they're questioning why they exist. What is the point of existence in the first place, if this is what we're going to do to each other? It is a depressing period, and understandably it is a depressing period. In terms of sources, I'm going to look at the Bennett thesis, the Thomas dissertation once again. But I'm also going to be looking at Jan Mueller, Memory and Power in Post-War Europe, Gilles McDonnell, After the Reich, The Brutal History of the Allied Occupation, and there are other sources that'll turn up here as well. There's one topic that I will not be dealing with here in terms of memory, which is the forget-me-not. That will be its own separate episode. But without further ado, let's get on with it. So this is part 5 of Masonry under the Reich, The Craft Remembers. So we enter into the post-war period. By May 7, 1945, at least 1.8 million German civilians and 3 million German troops lay dead. Those are probably conservative estimates, especially when it comes to civilians. We're really bad at counting that. There are 3.6 million homes destroyed, 7.5 million homeless people. To this came the liberators. And you would think all of the film, all of the books that you read, most of them talk about how wonderful it was, the liberators coming in, especially in Germany. But that's not always the case. Many came to punish with an iron rod. The Soviets came with their propaganda and their revolution. The French worked out their hatred in a few acts of grisly violence. Let me remind you what's happening in Paris, for example. Collaborators and members of the Vichy government are going to be shaven and walk naked through the streets of Paris to be hit with whatever people had as they parade through. We're going to have women brutalized for collaborating with the Nazis. We're going to see children killed. We're going to see a lot of things happen. And this is expected. This is what armies will tend to do when they've been through 5 years of brutality. The British saw their sector as a colony, no different than India, and they're going to treat them as subhuman compared to the British troops and the Commonwealth troops. The Americans turned to propaganda, photo, video, and, quote, field trips. And those field trips are disturbing because the American troops found it almost impossible to believe that any German living in the area could possibly not know about the death camps. And so they would bring them there. And oftentimes these are civilians who have nothing to do with the camp. They aren't related to it. They just happen to live 10 miles away. And they're going to be brought there, and they're going to be forced to dig graves. They're going to be forced to look at the bodies. They're going to be forced to look at the survivors. They will also reopen some of the concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. Not all of them. Again, these camps are massive. There's a death camp section, but there are other sections as well. But these will be put back into service as holding pens during, quote, denazification that takes place really between 45 and 47, where they take anyone who they believe is related to the Nazis, they put them there until they can, quote, denazify them or prove that they weren't Nazis. Really, the burden of proof is on the German people to prove that they weren't. And so you once again find yourself in this horrific position, if you are a German Mason, of needing to prove your loyalty. I'm getting this information from After the Reich by McDonnell. So let's deal with rebirth. What are they going to do? Now, Freemasonry returned to a number of European countries after the war through various avenues. In those countries absorbed into the Soviet Eastern Bloc, Freemasonry would remain outlawed, as it would in Spain because it's under Franco and it's basically a fascist state. An SD report issued in 1937 stated, quote, speaking of the lodge members in general, it could be said that they use every opportunity to defend Freemasonry and that they didn't know the non-Germanness of the lodges, but would join the lodges again in a heartbeat. And that's exactly what they do. So when the war ends, the Masons go back to meeting. Only weeks after Germany's surrender, members of Absalom, the first of the German lodges, met informally in Hamburg and planned for an official reconstitution of the lodge a week later. And think about it. Think about the position they're in. First of all, many of them had joined the party for various reasons that we've covered. And so the idea of identifying yourself as a Mason is going to be important because we know, the Allies know, that that's a persecuted group. But two, they need something that is stable. And so many times they will go back to the lodge because they remember that as a stable thing. We see the same thing after COVID. Many brothers will come back or have come back to the lodges for exactly the same reason. There's some stability there. There's something there that they can rely on in a world that has become quite unpredictable. So it's not all that surprising. If we deal with Germany specifically, we see that former German Masons began to meet in small groups to plan and discuss the return of Freemasonry to their shattered country. We're starting at the bottom and moving up. The Grand Lodges aren't starting it. This is starting at the lodge level. Oftentimes, groups that aren't even technically lodges are getting together and operating in that fashion because there are no Grand Lodges. There's nowhere to get any kind of approval. And so they're just going to act. Germany itself is, of course, divided into 4 occupational zones, which made the reactivation of a truly unified German Freemasonry particularly difficult. When we see the return, it tends to be fairly slow and only after a series of fits and starts, challenges, scandals, and arguments. It initially returns to Germany in the form of square and compass clubs, arranged by the Allies, the French, the British, the Americans, specifically by their occupying forces, for the purpose of holding schools of instruction or just general meetings. Because for the soldiers, it gives them an opportunity to practice the craft. The first attempts at bringing back domestic German Freemasonry to the war-torn country took place in 1945, when groups of Masons who had formerly belonged to the Humanitarian Grand Lodges began to hold meetings with the blessing of American authorities in Bensheim. In November of 45, the Federal Grand Lodge of Germany was hurriedly constituted. Now, this is West Germany. Almost everything I talk about here is going to be West Germany. Again, the Soviets are not going to allow Freemasonry in East Germany. This Grand Lodge, of course, does not last long, as the de facto consent of the American occupational government would be withdrawn after the death of the Grand Master a few months later. A second attempt occurred within the British zone of occupation at Hereford in 1946, with the majority of the Masons there belonging to the old Prussian lodges. Unsurprisingly, the group soon fell back on its previous emphasis on Christian character of the fraternity. This did not bode well. In between the first and second meetings, the Grand Mother Lodge of the Three Globes had held a meeting itself. Early in the negotiations for the reformation of a Grand Lodge of Germany, it soon became clear that the past collusion with the Nazis would not be forgotten as quickly as possible. In 47, a group made up of representatives of both Humanitarian and Old Prussian Grand Lodges, known as the Frankfurter Convent, again that term convent from the university fraternities in Germany, met in Frankfurt in June of 47 in order to determine a basis for which German Freemasonry might begin operating again. This meeting would be presided over by Dr. August Pauls, who in his opening address to the group stated that the majority of German Freemasons had in fact remained loyal to Masonic ideals and had not collaborated with the Nazis in any way. Many in the group preferred to, quote, in the words of past Grand Master, Heinrich Hopker, quote, "Let the past be buried." They wanted to move past it for obvious reasons. You don't want to remember that. You don't want to remember the trauma. You don't want to remember the decisions. Even if it was pragmatic, it's still something that you don't want to remember and draw in on. A second meeting of the convent would be held in July, in which it was resolved that, in quote, "In the future, there shall be one single craft masonry, without any division between Christian and humanitarian doctrines. By acknowledging the humanitarian ideal, by sharing a pure and beautiful human love, and by recognizing the brotherhood of all men, we profess the religion in which all men agree. We therefore unanimously pledge ourselves to the brotherly love, which is the cornerstone and cement of our fraternity." What they have done there, with that meeting, with that quote, is gone on the humanitarian side. We will accept, we will unify, we are not going to worry about the Aryan paragraph, we're not going to worry about the Christian unions and orders that we see out of the old Prussian lodges. We're going to move ahead in a more humanitarian direction, referring to the Humanitarian Grand Lodges. In May of 48, another meeting takes place in Frankfurt with the Grand Masters of several of the Grand Lodges, of the reconstituted Grand Lodges. The attendees concluded that unity could only be obtained by establishing a humanitarian-based Grand Lodge for the whole of Germany, and that all Masonic bodies, even those determined to be irregular prior to 1933, the Symbolic Lodge being one of them, should be allowed to join the group. In October of 48, a Grand Masters Conference will be held and determined to join together in a united Grand Lodge of Freemasons in Germany. This group later elected Dr. Theodor Vogel, this is a name that's going to come up a couple of times here, past master of the Grand Lodge of the Sun, as its Grand Master, and adopted a basic set of organizational principles. These included stipulations that, quote, The essence and object of Freemasonry are fully comprised in the 3 craft degrees, and that the creed of a candidate should not constitute an obstacle of his admission. So that's going to be a very humanitarian idea, that as long as you believe in a supreme being, you should be allowed in. This declaration was soundly rejected by the reconstituted National Grand Lodge of Freemasons in Germany, who refused to join the group as it still held on to its Christian Swedish rights. So this is one of the 11 Grand Lodges. The National Grand Lodge of Freemasons, or Landeslodge, is taking an issue with this. By June of 1949, West German Freemasons met in Frankfurt and founded what would be known as the Grand Lodge of Ancient Free and Accepted Masons. Ironically, the symbolic lodge of Germany in exile, remember Muffelman, the lodge that had been ostracized by all other German Freemasons, helped reestablish this German Grand Lodge and brought Freemasonry back to Germany. The symbolic lodge was helped by the newly formed Grand Lodge of the State of Israel and the United Grand Lodge of England. The Landeslodge also revived, and in 1958, these 3 German lodges, along with the Grand Lodge of British Freemasons in Germany and the American-Canadian Grand Lodge, both of which are established by occupying armies, came together and formed what would become the United Grand Lodge of Germany, which remains the governing body of Masonic lodges in Germany to this day. So we just saw a fight break out. First between the Prussian Grand Lodges and the Humanitarian. And then some of the lodges got involved and said, hey, we're not entirely sure about these ideas. And it turns out that the little ostracized symbolic Grand Lodge of Germany, founded in 1930, the most vocal opponent to the Nazis, are going to be the key player that brings everyone together and reorganizes Masonry in Germany. Almost unsurprising, but it's one of those tales where it just kind of rolls everything up. The storylines all line up. It's the movie that we want to see, that's going to feel good, because the underdog ultimately is the one who has all the power and does the right thing. So it's that classic melodrama, that classic American tale that we love to see. But we also have to deal with a second issue. The lodges have been reconstituted. Now they have to deal with the issue of memory. And memory is, as I've touched on, a tricky thing. Every time you remember something, you slightly rewrite it. Memory is not something that is going to be absolute. Just because you remember something a certain way doesn't mean it actually happened that way. So that makes things even trickier. And then you add all of the complications of what's happening in Germany during this period, and you can imagine where this is going to have to go. So from 1945 until 1973, involvement and collaboration of some German Masonic groups with the Nazis remained hidden in the mist of the past, especially to English language historians and authors. This is an intentional move to try and forget those years, to try and forget what had happened in that period. And it's necessary to the very mental survival of the brothers involved. The various Grand Lodges that emerged from the war characterized themselves as victims of the Third Reich, quote, too weak to resist. And that's going to be a term and an idea that's going to be key to all of this. That's the narrative that's going to be created, and which now attempted to pick up the pieces and help the German people heal. And by the way, this is all a reflection of a larger idea of how do the Germans heal? How did they get over this as a people, as a nation, knowing that they were responsible for World War II, for the Holocaust, for all the horrors that went into it? In yet another attempt to leave the past buried, the first public declaration of the new Grand Lodge would present a memory of Masonic persecution that, quote, had little in common with factual truth. Again, quoting, it asserted that not one single German Mason had taken part in Nazi crimes, which may have been true. Nevertheless, in 1949, former members of the Nazi Party, such as Wilhelm Lorenz, Hermann Dorner, Udo Sanonini, Kurt Hendrickson, Herbert Kessler, and Karl Hode, already were or soon would become prominent Masons under the new German Republic. Germany has this problem. Do you look back or do you look forward? And the Masons have to deal with the same thing. Do we worry about the things that people did to survive in 33, 34, and 35? 10 years ago? Or do we rely on the fact that they have grown and changed and the situation has simply altered? A detailed explanation of why or how men who had previously abandoned the fraternity could so easily return to it is outside the scope of this podcast. But the fact that Masonic lodges began reappearing within weeks of the war's end is worthy of note. With the death of National Socialism, all the societies, associations, clubs, and organizations under this Nazi umbrella disappeared. If former Freemasons wanted to continue some kind of exclusive organization, the simplest option was to reestablish the lodges rather than try and create something anew. Now, this is all according to Thomas. There may have been some nostalgia or genuine desire to reestablish Masonry, but after looking at how quickly and easily the lodges collapsed, it is more likely that the men wanted association, wherever it came from, and Masonry was the easiest way to reestablish that. And that is one idea behind it. All of the organizations are gone, Freemasonry can be fairly easily rebuilt, and so let's do that. But again, that's one idea. This is where history gets muddy. It's all about interpretation. Why did someone do this? We have no idea. We're not in their mind, but we can take educated guesses. There was, however, another motivation to quickly reestablish Freemasonry. The majority of German Freemasons actively sought to collaborate with the Nazi regime, as we have seen. As Nazi Germany fell to the Allies, the process of occupation and denazification began. Anyone who had any ties to the regime scrambled to find a way to distance themselves, and for former Freemasons, reestablishing the fraternity was a convenient way to do so. And you can say, well, that wouldn't happen, but again, in times of war, times of trauma, pragmatism tends to reign supreme. There was no doubt that the Nazis persecuted Freemasonry, and so to be able to reestablish connections with the fraternity gave former members something to point to and say, see, I wasn't a Nazi. In fact, I belong to a group that the Nazis persecuted. Before they could do this, however, the collaboration and willing cooperation of the previous decade had to somehow be explained in a way that acknowledged it and at the same time excused it. They are looking for forgiveness, but there's really no one to give them that, is there? Even if the other countries say, hey, we forgive you, it's not really the same thing. They're almost looking for forgiveness from themselves at this point. To that end, the lodges recreated their history under the Third Reich in a manner similar to that of the French regarding the Vichy government. Both Vichy and the majority of German Freemasons had made the same mistake and bet on the wrong horse. Although it was the right horse at the time. Again, they have no idea that the Nazis are going to win or lose, that Vichy is going to be the right or the wrong side of history. They simply attach themselves to whoever's in power at the time because surviving an extra day, week, or month is worth more than dying immediately on a poor decision. The nationalist, anti-Semitic Old Prussian lodges had gone to great lengths to distance themselves from the humanitarian lodges. And both Old Prussian and Humanitarian had gone to great lengths to distance themselves from the symbolic Grand Lodge of Germany. Yet, with Hitler's defeat, the tables were turned, and the Old Prussian and Humanitarian lodges stood on the wrong side, while the little symbolic Grand Lodge, which had previously been shunned by lodges on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as the Scottish Rite, could proudly boast of its activities under the regime. Men like Karl Hode, who was initially rejected from the party because of his membership, and struggled for years to get in, ultimately received an exemption from Hitler, returning to the lodges after the war in full fellowship. In Hode's case, he returned and served the lodge as a secretary until his death in 1973. Nobody challenged his return because most other German Freemasons had similar mixed histories. Thus, when German Freemasons began talking about life in the Third Reich, they imagined their actions as undesirable but necessary. An attempt to voluntarily give a little in order to achieve greater concessions, or avoid the forcing of greater concessions. In other words, if I leave the lodge which I love and join the party, I'm less likely to be punished in the same way as if I stay in the lodge. And again, pragmatism reigned supreme in these times. Just as the French reinvented Vichy France as a necessary or lesser of two evils, German Freemasons tried to justify their behavior in a similar fashion. In the interest of smoothing relations among German Freemasons, the Landeslodge issued a declaration in 1955, so before the United Grand Lodge of Germany, stating that it formally regretted the actions it took during the 1930s, including the severing of ties with other lodges. However, the declaration asked for understanding from other lodges, since these steps, though blatantly contrary to the basic tenets of Freemasonry, were taken in order to camouflage Freemasonry and escape the fate of other lodges. The myth of collaborating to protect was born. The declaration naturally caused a stir amongst other Grand Lodges, which were not so quick to forget, but at the same time were themselves guilty of coordinating to one degree or another. Once Neuberger, a profane, the Masonic term for a non-Mason, wrote his dissertation describing the Freemasons primarily as victims, Freemasons could begin to revisit the Hitler years and try again to reconstruct that history that the Landeslodge had suggested in 1955. Thus began the trickle of articles and short pieces on the victimization, persecution, and small but notable resistance of Masonic brothers. The symbolic Grand Lodge, which had been absolutely spurned by the old Prussian humanitarian lodges, suddenly became the poster child for the experience of Freemasonry in the Third Reich, as Freemasons fostered the image of the heroic minority struggling in the face of overwhelming Nazi pressure. And this is where we start running into issues. We get a lot of scholarship focusing on one side, basically looking at, because of confirmation bias or whatever other reason, they're trying to show the Masons as heroic, or at least as persecuted victims during the Hitler years. And the problem is that muddies the water. And so when you have historians coming in who are trying to put together the entire truth, the good, the bad, the indifferent, what I'm trying to do here, it becomes incredibly difficult because what's out there isn't really true. And that becomes clear when you start looking at sources because they start to reference each other and you see these problems arising. When you can't face your own truth, how can you possibly seek forgiveness, whether from yourself or from others? Once Bernheim and Melzer blew the whistle on this version of Masonic history, pointing out the errors and inconsistencies of the Freemasons as heroic underdogs, the debate over Masons as victims versus collaborators began. More important than identifying Freemasons as one or the other is examining the significance of the paradox. If Freemasons could be identified as both victims and collaborators, then there was interplay between the lodges and the regime, which we know there was. We know that the lodges are doing what they can to survive. We know that the lodges are going to collaborate as needed. And even this history that I'm presenting here is not without bias. Of course, I am a Mason. And so this is being presented in a way where I'm trying to get at those muddy points and nuance out these different topics, while unconsciously always taking the Masonic side. So even here you have to be cautious. So if the Freemasons, getting back to my point, could be identified as both victims and collaborators, then there was interplay. This means that Nazi persecution was not uniform and could be negotiated based on 4 factors. So unlike many other groups, not all, but many, the Freemasons had the ability to negotiate with the Nazis. So what are the 4 factors? First, did the Nazis identify the group as a non-racial group? In other words, did an individual belong to the group by virtue of birth? The answer is no. Was the group willing to coordinate? Well, as we've seen, the answer for the most part was yes. Did the group have anything to offer the regime in exchange for coordination? The answer is yes. We had educated men, we had skilled men, we had professionals who the regime couldn't go without, thus leading to the amnesty prior to World War II. Finally, was the regime willing to accept the coordination of the group? And in the end, they were ultimately. In the battle of ideologies between the Nazis and the Freemasons, arguably the Freemasons won. Because the Nazis, who hated the Freemasons, backed down, at least in Germany, and allowed the Freemasons to come into their professional roles. We know that they're informal Masonic groups, they're left alone because of the people who were involved. So in some way, you could argue that on an ideological level, the Freemasons may have won that one. The more questions to which a targeted group could answer yes meant the more that particular group could negotiate their persecution. Certain people are going to be persecuted: Grand Lodge officers, worshipful masters, so-called high-degree Masons as the Germans understood it. But others, Brother Bob, who sat on the sidelines, could well negotiate and get around things. And he may not be the one negotiating. It might be his lodge or someone on his behalf, or even his Grand Lodge. In the case of Freemasons, all but the last question could be answered in the affirmative, meaning that Freemasons had a substantial amount of wiggle room when it came to how they and the regime interacted. Thus, the dance of compromise began, and by looking at Freemasons, we can see how this dance played out in regards to one particularly significant group. And by the way, the waters are muddied in almost every persecuted group in Germany. It's not just the Masons. We see them follow similar patterns, an attempt to follow the rules, an attempt to collaborate. And by the way, that term collaborate doesn't always mean that you're in favor of. It simply means that you're not fighting against in some cases, in many cases. The Jews, for example, will try and follow the rules. They will try and get along as long as they can until they're sent away. In the case of the Freemasons, same thing. They're going to follow the rules. And so we get these muddy territories where there are times when things are accepted and times when they're not. Everyone dealing on both an ideological and pragmatic level. In the end, it is important to understand that World War II was the bloodiest and most traumatic conflict in human history. And war itself encourages amnesia. Post-war Germany poured all due energy into its reconstruction. And the coming of the Cold War encouraged rebuilding as quickly as possible. There was no broad repression of memories. Instead, memories were slowly and selectively changed or let go. Just to remind you, in times of trauma, it is natural to seek out ways to block or alter our past narratives, to change our understandings of ourselves and our actions and our reasons. Thus, myth-making in post-war Germany is born, and it doesn't just happen to Masons, it happens to just about everyone. And this is brought up by Mueller in Memory and Power. The story of a few members of the symbolic lodge becomes the story of German Masonry. Suddenly, that symbolic lodge has maybe 100,000 members. Everyone claims to have been a member of the symbolic lodge. And of course, many of those records no longer exist, or didn't at the time, although they do now. We have found them, many of them. Anything that was left in the East under Soviet control did not get accessed by the West until after 1990. The truth shifts as stories are going to be retold. After all, who do you want to be remembered as? A collaborator or the persecuted? In crisis, we all make pragmatic decisions based on the information at hand and our specific circumstances, which we understand as humans can change. While we may hope that we would act differently, in similar situational studies after the war by B.F. Skinner, the famous electrocute the other person study, we see that 85 to 90% of the population would have collaborated. Now think about that. We all sit here high and mighty in our history classes, reading our books, wherever else, and we say, I wouldn't collaborate. I'd fight against them. Who are you going to fight against? Are you going to take out a couple of SA troops just before you die? Are you going to try and take out the leader who you can't possibly get to? Or are you just going to go on and try to survive another day? And for the vast majority of people, that's what they're going to do. And in fact, the numbers that we see from Freemasonry pretty closely fit that 85 to 90% will just go along. Because they have to. Because there's a certain practical element. Yes, there are those who will fight. But even look at today. Look at who goes to protests. They aren't people in their 40s and 50s with children and families. They're people in their 20s who have a lot less to risk. And those aren't the people who were Freemasons in Germany in 1933. They aren't bringing in a lot of early 20s brothers. We're looking at a lot of gentlemen who have professional careers to think about, have families to think about, have their own survival to think about. And so they're going to follow along. And if you see your other brothers doing it, you're going to do it as well. Ultimately, survival trumps ideology. Add some manipulative psychology in there, and we don't stand a chance as humans. Look at how people follow politics today. People who 20 years ago would have been moderates or voting for either party, today are hard in one corner. These things happen over time, and we rewrite our narrative as they do. We forget who we voted for 20 years ago. We forget our ideals of 20 years ago. We are only who we are today. So the ultimate question of all of this is, do you stand for your ideals and watch your family become a target of aggression? Or join the party to ensure your family and perhaps your survival? At the end of the day, it's not just your life. It's not just the life of one Freemason who might stand up. At the end of the day, they're arguably victorious because Freemasonry comes back to Germany rapidly. So clearly it survives. It survives in the camps. It survives in the country in different forms. But ultimately it survives. Which brings us to our last topic. In the next episode, Masonry Under the Reich, Part 6, predictably, I want to cover the issue of the Forget-Me-Not. Another legend of this period that has a purpose, but it's also got an interesting history that I want to dig into. Next time, on Masonry Under the Reich, the Forget-Me-Not.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org. That's WIMasons.org. Learn more about Freemasonry and access more educational content and further light. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wimasons.org. Once again, that email address is education@wisconsinmasons.wimasons.org. Thank you for listening.